There's a warehouse in rural Virginia that does not appear on any public map. No sign out front, no listing on Google Street View, just a chain-link fence, a few security cameras, and a loading dock wide enough for 3 semi-trucks side by side. Inside that building, on shelves stretching 40 feet high, sits enough emergency gear to sustain thousands of people for months. Potassium iodide tablets, military-grade water purification systems, freeze-dried rations built for long shelf life, respiratory protection, medical supplies, radiation detection tools, communications gear, and almost none of it appears on the version of preparedness the public gets. That public version, the one on ready.gov, the one pushed every hurricane season and wildfire awareness month, tells you to keep 3 days of water, canned food, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio. 3 days. That is the guidance given to more than 330 million people in a country whose own emergency planners build scenarios around grid failures, mass evacuations, chemical releases, overwhelmed hospitals, wildfire smoke, and long-term supply chain disruption. This is not a conspiracy theory. The records are public if you know where to look. FEMA logistics documents, Department of Health and Human Services preparedness materials, Strategic National Stockpile disclosures, Department of Defense emergency planning manuals, and federal procurement databases like usaspending.gov. The information exists. It is just scattered across enough agencies, acronyms, and contract language that most people never assemble the full picture. Today, you're going to assemble it. Because the real divide is not between prepared people and unprepared people. It is between the emergency list made for public comfort and the emergency list built for operational reality. So here are 7 critical items the government either directly stockpiles or prepares with through the military and emergency systems it coordinates with. Items that almost never appear in mainstream public guidance. For each one, what it is, why it matters, what the evidence says, how you can get it, and why it stays mostly outside the public checklist. This is the list behind the warehouse door. Let's build the civilian version. Number 1. Potassium iodide. Imagine your thyroid quietly absorbing radioactive iodine for 2 or 3 days before anyone even confirms what happened. That is not fiction. After Fukushima, official guidance and contamination reality did not move at the same speed, and your thyroid would not wait for a press conference. It would do what it always does, pull iodine from your bloodstream as fast as it can, because your thyroid is the most iodine-hungry gland in your body. If that iodine is radioactive iodine-131 from a reactor accident or a nuclear release, the damage can begin immediately. In children, the risk is even worse. Chernobyl made that brutally clear. The surge in thyroid cancers afterward was not theoretical. It was measurable, documented, and tragic. Potassium iodide, or Ki, works because it saturates the thyroid with stable iodine before radioactive iodine arrives. Once the gland is full, it cannot absorb much more. The dangerous version is far more likely to pass through the body instead of lodging in thyroid tissue. This does not protect your whole body from radiation. It protects one gland from one specific isotope. But that one protection matters enormously because the thyroid regulates metabolism, energy, cardiovascular function, and a long chain of hormonal processes you do not want collapsing during a larger emergency. Federal agencies know this. The Strategic National Stockpile maintains Ki reserves. Federal procurement records show large purchases. Ki distribution planning exists specifically around nuclear plant emergency zones. And there is a reason for that. Dozens of reactors operate across the United States, and millions of Americans live within potential exposure range. Yet most people have never bought a single dose. Why? Because once you start openly telling people to buy anti-radiation medication, you are forced to admit that the nuclear risk map is not abstract. It is geographic, it is current, and it includes ordinary communities that do not think of themselves as living near a nuclear problem. Ki is cheap, legal, and easy to store. A pack of 130 milligram tablets usually costs around $15. Shelf life is often 7 to 10 years when properly stored. Many pharmacies carry it without prescription. This is one of the easiest, cheapest upgrades you can make. And if item 1 protects a gland from a specific threat, item 2 protects the one thing you cannot stop using during a disaster for even 10 seconds, your lungs. Number 2. N95 respirators. August 2018, Butte County, California. During the campfire, the air quality in some areas became so bad that the normal pollution scale barely described it. Smoke choked roads, homes, schools, evacuation routes. People were driving through air they could barely see through. And for a long time, the average person was still getting soft, vague advice. Stay indoors, limit exposure, use a face covering if needed. A face covering. That phrase hides a massive difference in protection. The second item is a NIOSH-certified N95 respirator. The Strategic National Stockpile has contained huge numbers of N95s for years, and COVID made that public in a way few people had fully appreciated before. But those respirators were never just for pandemics. They matter in wildfire smoke, building collapse dust, ash events. An N95 is tested to filter at least 95% of particles at the 0.3 micron level under standardized conditions. That matters because many of the most dangerous airborne particles are small enough to travel deep into the lungs, where they trigger inflammation, reduce oxygen exchange, and can worsen or create long-term respiratory damage. A cloth mask is not in the same category. It may help somewhat in low-level conditions. It is not equivalent protection in a real smoke or particulate emergency. That is why emergency systems maintain serious respiratory protection reserves, even while public messaging often defaults to broad, simplified wording. The good news, this one is easy. A box of N95s is inexpensive, widely available, and compact. Keep them sealed, dry, and out of UV exposure, and they store well for years. Buy more than you think you need because in a real event, you will not be the only person trying to find them. And once your lungs are protected, the next question is simple. What exactly are you going to eat if the disruption lasts longer than a weekend? Number 3. Long shelf life emergency rations. One of the biggest lies in public preparedness is not a false statement. It's a soft understatement. Store foods your family normally eats. That sounds practical. It also collapses the difference between a minor inconvenience and a real emergency. Under stress, the human body burns more energy, not just from physical labor, but from temperature regulation, poor sleep, stress hormones, immune load, and constant uncertainty. Military nutrition research found that people operating under sustained field conditions can require dramatically more calories than they would under normal daily life. That is why emergency feeding systems don't revolve around canned soup and snack crackers. The third item is high-calorie, long shelf-life emergency food. Freeze-dried meals, ration bars, and other purpose-built emergency nutrition. Federal emergency logistics and military supply systems both rely heavily on foods designed for shelf stability, portability, calorie density, and deployment under difficult conditions. There is a reason for that. In a real disruption, food is not just about having something to eat, it's about maintaining energy, decision-making, body heat, and the ability to keep functioning when everything around you is unstable. Canned food has a role, but it has major limitations. It's heavy for the calories it provides. It often needs a can opener, creates waste, and in many cases adds a lots of sodium while giving relatively little usable energy. It's fine as part of a plan, it's not the backbone of one. Freeze-dried meals and emergency ration systems solve different problems. High calories, long storage, lighter weight, and easier scaling. The math gets serious fast. Even a modest adult might need 2,500 to 3,000 calories a day in a stressful emergency.
Over 2 weeks, that becomes real volume. If you plan around a few cans in the pantry, you are not planning for disruption. You are planning for delay. A basic 2-week reserve of quality emergency food is still affordable for most households if built gradually. You do not need a bunker. You need caloric realism. And that leads directly into the next problem. Because even the best food stockpile fails fast if you cannot safely process water after your stored supply runs out. 4. Multi-stage water filtration. 1 gallon per person per day is one of those emergency rules that sounds solid until you actually examine it. A gallon is enough for very basic drinking and minimal use if conditions are mild and the crisis is short. But once heat rises, movement increases, hygiene deteriorates, or the event stretches beyond a few days, that number starts looking less like a plan and more like a placeholder. Stored water is important, absolutely, but stored water runs out. The real challenge begins when the taps stop and the only available water is whatever you can collect, carry, filter, or disinfect. That is why serious field operations use purification systems, not just storage containers. Military and disaster response units deploy portable water treatment equipment because they understand the basic truth public advice rarely emphasizes. In a prolonged emergency, your survival depends less on what water you stored and more on what water you can make safe. For civilians, the fourth item is a multi-stage water filtration system, ideally paired with a chemical disinfection backup. A good gravity-fed or portable filter rated to around 0.1 to 0.2 microns can remove bacteria and protozoa that make untreated water dangerous. Giardia and Cryptosporidium do not care whether the crisis came from a hurricane, blackout, wildfire, or supply collapse. They just need contaminated water and an unprepared host. But filtration alone is not always enough. Viruses, some chemical contaminants, and heavy metals may require additional treatment depending on the source. That is why layered systems matter. The chemical backup is simple and old school. Unscented household bleach, used correctly, can disinfect biologically contaminated water. FEMA's more technical guidance discusses this, but most people never read that far. The infographic-level version rarely gives enough detail for serious planning. This is where preparedness stops being symbolic and becomes practical. Not, do you have 3 gallons in the closet, but can you make creek water, rainwater, or questionable tap water safe for a family for 2 weeks? That is a very different question. And item 5 is where the list shifts from obvious emergency gear into the kind of field-use compound most people never hear about at all. 5. Potassium permanganate. Here is what prolonged disaster conditions actually do to the human body. Not just dramatic trauma, not explosions and movie scene injuries. More often, skin breakdown, fungal infections, contaminated wounds, soaked feet, infected scratches, bad hygiene, and small problems quietly turning serious because normal medical systems are gone. That is where the 5th item comes in, potassium permanganate. And this is where precision matters. Unlike Ki, N95s, or antibiotics, potassium permanganate is not publicly documented in FEMA stockpile disclosures at the same level. So let's be exact. This item belongs on the list not because there is some clean public record of FEMA warehouses full of purple crystals, but because it is a documented field-use compound in military field medicine, emergency treatment guidance, and water sanitation contexts that overlap with the same kinds of scenarios government planners prepare for. That distinction matters. Potassium permanganate is one of those old, multi-purpose compounds that serious field medicine values because it does several useful things in a small, lightweight package. In very dilute solution, it has been used as an antiseptic wash for certain skin infections, fungal conditions, and contaminated wounds. In other contexts, it has water treatment applications. It can also serve in fire-starting applications when combined with the right reactant. One compound, several uses. Minimal storage footprint. Why is it absent from mainstream public guidance? Partly because it can be misused. Concentration matters. If used incorrectly, it can irritate or injure tissue. That makes it the kind of item agencies avoid recommending to the general public in simplified checklists. But if you are thinking seriously about field hygiene, not just survival in the cinematic sense, but survival in the slow, infection-heavy, uncomfortable reality of disrupted sanitation, this is worth learning about from proper sources. It is inexpensive, shelf-stable when stored correctly, and available through some pool, agricultural, or specialty suppliers. This section is based more on military field medicine and emergency treatment guidance than on a straightforward FEMA procurement trail. That transparency is important. And the next item may be even more important, because if the grid goes down long enough, information becomes its own life support system. 6. Multi-band shortwave radio with hand crank or solar charging. This is not a fringe prepper obsession. Emergency planning frameworks still rely heavily on radio because radio continues to function when newer systems fail. FEMA's alert architecture, weather systems, emergency broadcasters, and amateur radio partnerships all reflect the same reality. When infrastructure degrades, radio becomes one of the last resilient channels left. AM/FM is useful, but shortwave adds something critical: reach beyond your immediate area. That means if local stations go silent, you may still be able to receive updates from outside the disaster zone. That changes everything. Local confusion becomes regional context. Rumor gets replaced by signal. During major disasters, amateur radio operators and shortwave listeners often become early sources of situational awareness long before normal communications are restored. That is not nostalgia, that is redundancy. A good unit with solar and hand-crank charging is affordable, compact, and grid-independent. Kaito, Eaton, and Sangean all make respected civilian models. One radio can give you weather, alerts, regional updates, and a way to understand whether conditions are stabilizing or deteriorating. In the first 72 hours of a serious emergency, information is not a luxury, it's a survival resource. And item 7 is the one that post-disaster mortality data has been screaming about for years. 7. Broad-spectrum antibiotics. After many disasters, the first wave of death gets the headlines. The second wave often gets a footnote. After earthquakes, hurricanes, and infrastructure collapses, people don't just die from impact trauma. They die from infected wounds, untreated respiratory infections, contaminated water illnesses, and routine bacterial problems that become lethal when healthcare access breaks down. That pattern has repeated across disasters worldwide, which is why the 7th item is a broad-spectrum antibiotic reserve, particularly drugs like amoxicillin or doxycycline, obtained legally through a physician and stored responsibly. This one is not speculative. The Strategic National Stockpile maintains massive antibiotic reserves. Public records, preparedness documents, and related programs make that clear. Government planners understand a simple fact: when hospitals are overwhelmed or inaccessible, bacterial infections become a second disaster layered on top of the first. Doxycycline covers a wide range of likely emergency-relevant problems, including some respiratory infections, certain wound and skin infections, and several vector-borne diseases. Amoxicillin covers another broad set of common bacterial infections. Together, they represent the kind of practical coverage emergency planners know becomes valuable when care is delayed. So why is this absent from public readiness lists? Because the moment you start telling the public to stock antibiotics, you open a mess of issues: resistance, misuse, allergies, incomplete courses, self-diagnosis errors, and legal restrictions around prescribing. Those are real concerns, but they don't erase the underlying reality that governments keep antibiotic reserves for a reason. The responsible path here is not panic buying or internet quackery. It's a legitimate conversation with a doctor about emergency preparedness, disrupted access to care, travel, remote conditions, and what is medically appropriate for your household. If a disaster can cut you off for treatment for a week or more, that conversation matters before the emergency, not during it.
What ties all 7 of these together is not paranoia, it is planning logic. There is a built-in tension at the heart of emergency management, the gap between what officials prepare for operationally and what they feel comfortable recommending publicly. If public agencies openly promoted a preparedness list centered on potassium iodide, N95 respirators, multi-stage filtration, shortwave radios, emergency rations, and antibiotic reserves, it would raise immediate questions. Questions about nuclear risk, about mass smoke events, about grid instability, about overwhelmed healthcare systems, about whether the government can actually reach everyone fast enough in a true large-scale emergency. Those are uncomfortable questions, so the public-facing checklist stays simple: 3 days of water, some food, a flashlight, a radio. Advice designed to be calm, broad, and politically manageable. But the operational world tells a more serious story. That world includes stockpiles, procurement contracts, response frameworks, field manuals, logistics centers, and contingency planning for events far more severe than a weekend storm. And when you read across all of it,
a different preparedness picture emerges. A picture built around air that may become dangerous to breathe, water that may stop being safe, food systems that may not come back quickly, communications that may fail, medical care that may become inaccessible, and specialized threats, radiation, contamination, secondary infection, that do not wait for official reassurance. That is the real lesson here.